Say clearing out the corruption in your terms, would that mean clearing out the top level federal service workers that are currently at the FDA and the CDC?
In some categories, I would say.
What does that look like? Yeah.
In some categories of workers, there are entire departments, like the nutrition departments at FDA, that have to go, that are not doing their job. They're not protecting our kids.
It is Donald Trump's pick to head the agency in charge of Health and Human Services. Joining our breaking news coverage, New York Times investigative reporter Suzanne Craig is here. She's done extensive reporting on RFK, which revealed that RFK said he had a dead worm in his brain that caused him to lose some of his memory in a legal filing. Sue Craig, your thoughts?
No, it's interesting. I have to say, when I started covering Bobby Kennedy, it must be almost a year ago, I didn't think we'd see this day. But that story was really interesting, and it gave us, to me, some of the, I think, deepest insights we've seen about Bobby Kennedy and his concerns about mercury and what happened, I think, most importantly to him, back, I think it was in 2010 or 11, and that has to deal with the worm. They actually did find a dead worm in his brain, and he came to doctors complaining of severe long-term and short-term memory loss. In those discussions he had with doctors, they discovered the dead worm in his brain. But I think what was actually causing his problems was that he had mercury poisoning. They found that the mercury levels in his system were 10 times the EPA average. And it's interesting, that seems in doctors, and I've talked to Bobby Kennedy about it, he thinks that it was actually what was causing his memory loss. But he got that through eating predatory fish. Tuna was one of them. He said he was subsisting on a heavy diet of tuna that caused the mercury levels in his system to spike. It's interesting, given he was an environmental lawyer, he had railed against mercury levels in fish, that he actually decided that a diet that heavy and that sort of fish was okay. But after that, he went through chelation therapy to sort of remove these metals from his system. And it's the same. Mercury is obviously the thing that he's concerned about that is in some vaccines as a preservative. So this is sort of all tied together when I talked to him, and he went through this therapy to actually strip his system. He did it with a cream, he said, which was a lighter therapy than other therapies that people go through. But this is all tied together when now we come back to the issue of vaccines and how he's going to treat it now that he's running this incredibly important department.
Sue, was the dead worm in his brain from a vaccine or from the sushi?
From neither, actually. As far as we don't quite know how the worm got there, he thinks it came from eating pork when he was overseas traveling. Yeah, and it got into. We don't really know though how it got in there, but normally when you have a worm in your brain and it's alive, it can live for a long time, and then it usually the symptoms when the worm dies is usually there's inflammation. And it flares up, and what you show up to the hospital with is usually seizures. It's not memory loss. And short and long-term memory are controlled by different parts of the brain. So it's interesting because when he went there, the worm was found because they thought the severe memory loss that potentially he had a stroke or that he had a tumor in his brain. They weren't sure. And because of what his uncle had gone through, his uncle Ted Kennedy had died of a brain tumor. He was immediately seen by doctors across the country, and they immediately all thought he had a brain tumor and they wanted to operate on him. And then he was preparing to actually go down to Duke to have an operation, and another doctor that he met kind of in this process of seeing doctors said, hang on, I think it could be something else. And what they saw in the scan was actually the dead worm. And it turns out all that was unrelated, and that separately he just had this mercury poisoning that was going on that was actually causing the long and the short-term memory loss. It's an incredible journey, and I learned about it all, just so people are kind of wondering how all this came to light. I learned about it through depositions that I reviewed that were given as part of a divorce proceeding from his second wife, Mary Kennedy.
A lot of the commentary over the last week has been about the confirmation hurdles. It's not clear to me that Trump's intent is that any of these people are ever confirmed. He has a real affinity for acting officials. But should he proceed with an FBI background check, which is a step in the Senate confirmation process, what sorts of things do you think would be unearthed?
I don't know about unearthed. I think he's going to get a lot of questions about his views on things like vaccines and other views that he's espoused. In terms of his background, I'm not sure what will come up there that would be fishy. I'm just kind of turning my memory right now to think if we know of any arrests or anything. Yes, good point. But I think a lot of what he's going to face in front of a confirmation hearing is his views. A lot of them are very controversial, as we've been talking about on different things, and his plans for these departments. He's talking about wholesale shutting a lot of them down.
So I want to make a larger point about Tulsi, about Bobby Kennedy Jr., about Matt Gaetz. It's a gigantic attack on expertise, on the idea that there are people who know things based on their training, based on their education, that regular folks don't know. Mm-hmm. And by putting people who are unqualified as the head of these agencies, and by the way, people who have never run big agencies, which is another expertise that they have, it's a way of Trump saying, I'm immune from criticism because I know just as much as you do. I'm putting you there because of your fealty to me, not because of your expertise. And one of the classic harbingers of authoritarian leaders is this attack on expertise, because experts can question them. Mm-hmm. And by putting people who are not experts and not qualified, he then becomes exempt. That's this kind of larger strategy, and it's a real disservice to the American people. And you know, we've been in the business now of defending the status quo for a while because he has been so out there. But these are agencies and places that really take expertise and knowledge, and by putting people who don't have that in there, that's making everybody more vulnerable.
I mean, I think that's the reality of it, but the political reality is that it's devastating for Trump if none of these agencies function. He ran on a promise to lower crime. Well, you can't do that without the Department of Justice. He ran on a promise to get his arms around illegal immigration in this country. You've got a dog killer in charge of that agency who may or may not be confirmed. I mean, the idea that you can dismantle every agency that touches people's lives and survive politically seems like the foolish move here.
I completely agree, and I hope that chicken comes home to roost. But what he's also depending on is that discretion within the Senate on both sides, where a president has the prerogative of appointing who he wants, and we need to give the president the person who he wants. And I mean, I also think it's just insane for some of these folks to accept his offer to go through that process, because, you know, whether it's Matt Gaetz, whether it's Bobby, whether it's Tulsi Gabbard, you're going to have all kinds of things come out that you don't want to have to see the light of day.